Hello and welcome. This week brings us to the end of the Easter season. This weekend, this Sunday, celebrates in our tradition Pentecost, the 50th day of the Easter time. Now the readings here, there is a variety of readings, so I'll give them all and then kind of indicate why certain ones might be chosen or not. The first reading is pretty much always the same. It comes from the book of Acts, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11, which describes the coming of the Spirit. The second reading, there are choices. The first reading, first of the second reading would be from 1 Corinthians, chapter 12, verses 3 through 7, 12 through 13, they skip around. And then there's a second choice, which would be a selection from the letter of Paul to the Galatians, chapter 5, verses 16 through 25. When it comes to the gospel, again, there will be two choices. The first would be from John's gospel, chapter 20, verses 19 through 23. And then the second choice would be from John's Gospel also, but this time from chapter 15, verses 26 through 27, chapter 16, verses 12 through 15. Now, the two alternate readings for the second and third readings are assigned for what we call the B year, and as you know, this year we are in the B year, and so those would be readings that I would like to comment on for the most part today, because they could be used this coming weekend depending on where you are and who perhaps the celebrant is when he or she chooses the readings that would be used. This weekend is called the celebration of Pentecost. What we do know is that this feast in Jewish life, that would be in the time certainly of the Jesus and of the early disciples, was one of the three major pilgrim feasts that was observed by Israel. In other words, the great feast was the celebration of the Passover, but 50 days later, would be also celebrated the feast of Pentecost, hence the term Pente, 50. And these were basically agricultural feasts, marking what Pentecost did, the end of the grain harvest. It was also, this particular feast was called the Feast of Weeks. You can kind of figure that out, how that comes up to 7 weeks after the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. So 7 times 7, 49, plus 1, 50. That's how that number emerges within the Hebraic tradition. So essentially, basically, originally were, as we mentioned, agricultural feasts, and then was also known as or after the Feast of the Unleavened Breads. That kind of historically, it gives a little bit of background, because by the time that Israel was celebrating Pentecost, it was also remembering that this giving of the gift of the Torah or the law on Mount Sinai. So although Passover represented one aspect of Jewish life, the celebration of Pentecost had taken on the important gift of Moses receiving from the Lord the gift of the tablets of the law. Now the scene itself, well, let's begin with the one scene that everyone kind of regularly remembers, is that the disciples, the followers of Jesus, had been advised at the time of Jesus' ascension That would be parts that were told in chapter 1 of Acts, and we commented on some of those aspects last week. Now find about 120. Now we're not sure that there were actually 120 gathered in the upper room, but at one point in time they were. We remember that the 12 disciples are there, apostles now. Matthias had been chosen to fill out the absence of Judas. Also present there were, at least initially, women, Mary, the mother of Jesus, Mary Magdalene, other women. So we're not quite sure exactly what the makeup of that community that was gathered in the room was. The events that happened show that Luke, who is the author of this particular account, was aware of Jewish tradition, Jewish background, because what you get, and we perhaps have noticed this at other times, but you have all the realities of what would be called a theophany, namely an appearance or a presence of the divine. What are some of the characteristics of a theophany? Well, thunder, okay, that there's a kind of noise. And that's how this account, as we hear it, that there was a great noise happened where these disciples were gathered, which attracted other people who were present in Jerusalem. But there was thunder at Sinai when the law of God had been given to Moses. So there's the first aspect. And that God often spoke out of a whirlwind, out of a great kind of powerful wind. Well, notice again in this account that there is a wind. So the Spirit is connected with wind. God had spoken out of the whirlwind. The book of Job speaks of that in that account. Moses, of course, is spoken to by God out of the whirlwind. There's no really speaking happens in this account, but there is the presence of the wind. And then there is the visual presence. So those would be audio, those which appear to the ears. And now you get a visual, the coming of the Spirit in fire. And fire, again, traditionally, in this case, the pictures as tongues of fire settling over the heads of all who were gathered there. This is called glossolalia, which translates means foreign tongues. And that's what we will hear in this episode, that when Peter speaks, that there are people who have gathered there from all different tongues, but they all hear what Peter is saying. And that leads to a point that we have perhaps made on other occasions, that some commentators see this coming of the Spirit as a reversal of what happened at the Tower of Babel, which is recorded in the book of Genesis. Remember when the citizens wanted to build a tower that would reach up to the heavens, God was kind of smiled at that, nice try, and decided to confuse the language that each of them were speaking, so that they literally, that's where the title Tower of Babel comes from, because apparently young babies, when they are first talking, are generally considered to be babbling or babling, and that's what happened. So what Pentecost will do is reverse what had happened there, and now everyone can hear the message in their own tongue, in their own language. So all of those are powerful symbols that certainly Luke was aware of as he tells this opening story, and again, references back to earlier times, but fundamentally, we might suggest the giving of the Torah or the law, and that's why Israel found this a very important occasion to remember and to celebrate. Now, it is also pictured that there were gathered in Jerusalem many peoples. Now, it's important to notice here that this event involves only members of the Jewish experience or the Israeli community. Were there Jews who were living in Jerusalem? Yes, of course, and that would be who gathered when they heard this sound or this noise. It could have also included, and that's how the account opens up here, pilgrims. That would be members of the Jewish community who had come to Jerusalem for the celebration of this event. Now, it's interesting that a number of different places are mentioned: Parthians, Medes, and Ammonites. Those would all be a kind of territories to the perimeters of the Roman Empire at the time. And remember, this is the world that Luke is familiar with, the Mediterranean world, which was considered in his time to be the Roman world. The Mediterranean was our sea, Mare Nostra, so therefore you had, and the Parthians from the Roman point of view were the one group of people who they feared. They did not want and were afraid if they crossed the borders into their territory, that is Roman territory, there would be problems. Well, all right, so those mentions, we don't know why, and we can only guess that what Luke is trying to say is that there were gathered in Jerusalem meant people from all around the Mediterranean world, which would in some ways indicate an ends of the earth, although, again, we've talked about how just that was understood in those early days. The Medes and the Ammonites, even in the time that Luke is speaking of, were ancient kingdoms, and they no longer really had political influence or power, but nevertheless, Israel had kind of tangled with them, and so that would be also part of it. Then you had from Cappadocia to Pamphylia. Included in there would be Pontus, Asia, and Phrygia. All of these were part of Asia Minor. So you notice how, if you have a little bit of a map, where all of those places are located. Pontus, by the way, was the place from which Aquila and Priscilla had come. So Luke is also incorporating here, I know this is like a little bit of a puzzle here, but incorporating a number of different kind of comings together that are already beginning at this great moment of the coming of the Spirit. Finally, just to indicate places there, some came from Egypt as far as Cyrene. Simon of Cyrene, of course, is mentioned in the scriptures, but those would be in Africa. And then also mentions visitors from Rome. There was a Jewish community, obviously, in Rome. So when you put all of that together, gathered around this room where Peter, as the spokesman, speaks from, we appear, if they were in the upper room, then there would have been, nicely for picturesque purposes, a balcony out of which he could stand and speak to these people who gathered. Why? Because they heard this sound. So again, it is interesting as the great event of the coming of the Spirit upon those disciples gathered in the upper room involves also citizens or visitors of the city of Jerusalem itself. And now, the coming of the Holy Spirit. Just a word about the Holy Spirit. It is certainly in our tradition that when we speak of the Spirit of coming, we've noticed this on other occasions, the word holy, when it of course is capitalized, refers to Spirit, and thus is one way of speaking of God. Holy, with a lowercase, could simply be a quality that refers to God, that God has holiness. Well, Another kind of interesting issue is whether the Holy Spirit was the feminine. Now, that would therefore indicate a sense of the motherhood of God. Here's the issue. Spirit in Hebrew is feminine. In Greek, it's neuter. In Latin, it's masculine. So when you translate Holy Spirit, do you give it a gender? We do find in some of the early writers of the 1st and 2nd century indication of the feminine aspect of the Spirit. But all of that would be settled when at the Council of Constantinople, which would be the Second Ecumenical Council that met in the year 380, it was decided, and it was here that the doctrine, which we will refer to next time, of the Trinity was developed. Since Father and Son are masculine and the Spirit is joined with them, the Spirit now will always be thought of as masculine. So I just mentioned this, kind of some discussions have gone on, but in point of fact, from Christian tradition onward from that council, always the Spirit is described in the masculine. So all of that is a little bit of background to the opening story, which of course is the foundational story for the celebration of Pentecost. And Peter, what is not perhaps left out a little bit, but which concludes, is Peter's speech is so powerful that that day 3,000 were made members of the community of believers. They were all baptized. Now, we can only smile and say, how did they do all of that? Where did they get all the water to do all that? But it is certainly this coming of the Spirit, also sometimes characterized as the birthday of the church, okay? So this is when the Spirit of Jesus abides now with the community. So all of that, again, just to the most familiar story that we have. Concluding a bit here, remembers that the Torah, namely in Judaism, was given on the Feast of the Celebration. There was widespread use in Judaism of fire as a symbol of the Torah. So keep the connection here that we've been speaking of. There's a strike, and Philo, who was one of the Jewish writers of the time, does connect fire with the Torah. And then there is the consistent typology with Moses receiving the law. So all of that, not to make this story any longer, tells the grandeur of the coming of the Spirit and the beginning of the mission of the disciples to share the gospel, and as we just mentioned, quite a grand and glorious beginning as this episode is recorded. Now, the choice of the gospel, as we mentioned, is twofold. One of the standard given for this day is the same gospel that is used on Easter Sunday. And in fact, there is a repetition if that is used. You remember that that's the story where Jesus appears to the disciples in the upper room. They are hidden away for fear of the leadership. Jesus is present. He says, "Peace be with you," and then receive the Holy Spirit. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven, whose sins you retain are retained. So that is a regular choice of reflection for Pentecost, and you can see that in John's point of view, the giving of the Spirit is actually done by Jesus, and it is given on Easter, whereas the episode we've been looked at takes place later on and Luke has his own narrative about that. But the other gospel that is chosen, and because this is the B year, it is the one that is perhaps recommended, is in John 15. Now, it is here in this section that Jesus, remember that this again is going to be part of the long prologue or speech that Jesus gives before his arrest. It's one of the episodes of the Last Supper. Says that Jesus will send the Paraclete. And the Paraclete's role, or advocate, depending on how you translate this, is to bear witness concerning Jesus. This is found in verse 26. So remember, what we're looking at is chapter 15, verse 26, 27, and then chapter 16, verses 12 through 15. And again, the liturgist edited out for various reasons, but they want to focus attention on the role of the Spirit. The disciples, Jesus then says to them, are to also testify to the truth that which you have received because you were with me from the beginning. But Jesus' point in this little section is they're not yet ready to do this task, okay? Now, what is the role of the Spirit? Well, as an advocate, will offer further revelation that was part of the many things that the disciples were not yet ready to get. See, so Jesus is saying in this section, there are some of you've learned things from me, you've seen things that I've done, you know my relationship to the Father, but there are still things that you have not yet fully grasped or not yet fully received. So that will be the mission of the Spirit. Now, keep in mind, we've noticed this before, but just to reiterate, that the community that first received the fourth gospel was caught up in an intramural conflict within Judaism concerning belief in Jesus. This passage that we hear anticipates this conflict. Jesus speaks directly to the situation in which his followers will find themselves, by believing in Jesus, will be excommunicated from the synagogues and even killed on account of faith in him. Now, we've seen this in other episodes of John's story. You remember the curing of the blind man, and his parents had been called in and said, was he blind from birth? And he said, yes. And how did he get his sight back? And they say, oh, he's old enough to answer for himself, because they feared that they would be excluded from the synagogue. And the blind man later on, when confronted by the leaders, is also excommunicated. So the reality was that there were members of Judaism who were excommunicated or cut off from or thrown out of the synagogue because of their belief in Jesus. So this passage, and as mentioned, anticipates this conflict that happened not necessarily in Jesus' time, but certainly in the time in which the fourth gospel, was written. So in the midst of Jesus' trial, he says, the Spirit, and whose trial will they be? Those who accept Jesus will stand as their advocate. Now, the role of the Spirit to be an advocate might be seen as a prosecutor. Those of you who are familiar with law and order stories, trial, and that, remember that the prosecutor is the one who presents the case for the establishment. Here, the Spirit will be speaking to the other Jews who do not accept Jesus or believe him to be truly the Messiah. So in that sense, it prosecutes those to whom this is being directed, because sometimes, and it's understandable how this has developed, the Spirit is seen as supportive of those who believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Well, that's true also, but in this case, it seems to be a little bit different. So, what is the role of the Spirit? As Jesus will tell his disciples, and this perhaps is something for us to notice as we hear this episode, the role of the Spirit is to interpret new situations in ways consistent with the identity and mission of Jesus. So if there are more things to be learned about Jesus, that is the role of the Spirit, and that is the role that the Spirit will execute after, of course, Jesus' resurrection and ascension. So that would be one of the reasons why the role of the Spirit, or what is the role of the Holy Spirit in the life of the early church. I just want to have a word or two in our conclusion here to the fact that we've noticed this before, but I want to mention it once again, that one of the kind of liturgical ideas that developed in the church throughout the centuries was the use of a sequence. Sequences were often poetic songs, so that if you look at the poetry, they rhyme or they balance out, but they were also certainly sung. There were many, many sequences in the medieval churches, but they were, when the reform of the liturgy took place, restricted. In fact, in the year 1570, when the liturgy was developed, there were just 4 sequences. These are usually sung after the second reading in the liturgy. One called the Victimae Paschalis, which was used on Easter Sunday. The second, Veni Sancte Spiritus, which was used during the octave of Pentecost. The Laudacion, which is used on the Feast of Corpus Christi. And the Dies Irae, those of you from an older time will remember, was used on All Souls Day and at many of the Requiem Masses in the past. In 1727, a 5th one was added, the Stabat Mater, which is used also in the Lenten season. So there will be, in most of your celebrations this weekend, the Veni Sancte Spiritus, Come Holy Spirit sequence. This, of course, enables the community who is praying and worshiping to partake in celebrating the occasion. Because when you're doing the readings, while you're just listening, yes, there is the psalm verse, but here now you have a whole kind of little narrative, which goes through many of the gifts that the Spirit is pictured as giving, and so I encourage us to kind of partake in this. Those of you who like history, the Veni Sancte Spiritus goes all the way back to the time of the Emperor Charlemagne in the year 800, who inaugurated and inspired the use of this particular sequence. We're still not quite sure who wrote it, but that's one of the traditions that is linked with it. And sometimes it is called the golden sequence because of the antiquity of it and because of the beauty of it. So if you have a chance, you might look it over. There are some variant versions of this now that are used in our hymnals, but and as we mentioned before, it used to be sung throughout the week after Pentecost, but with the revision of the liturgy, that has been eliminated. So really, we only have one opportunity to celebrate it. In conclusion, a reminder that the Monday, that is the day after this celebration of Pentecost, is a new feast which Pope Francis has established as Mary, Mother of the Church. So it's a kind of interesting little conclusion to the Easter season, remembering Mary as first model of believers, Mother of the Church, model Christian, and in this month of May is an appropriate time to remember her. Thank you for being with us, and hope you have a good week.